A guten Erev Shabbos. One way to get yourself an eternal place in history is to attack the Jewish people. The name of Haman persists in history and will remain forever because he attacked the Jews and hatched a plan to wipe us out. Conversely, we have a mitzvah of Mechias Amalek, to wipe out the memory of Amalek, who was the ancestor of Haman. We could talk for hours about how ironic this mitzvah is. We have to recall the memory of Amalek each year so that, in order to eradicate his memory from beneath the heavens, we spin our grogers, we shake our maracas, we blow our vuvuzelas to drown out even the mention of his name. Yeshiva Bachrim used to chalk the name Amalek on the bottom of their shoes, and they would stomp their feet every time his name was mentioned during the Megillah reading, to stamp out the name of Amalek. There's a term, Simcha Shal Mitzvah, if you've heard of that, the joy of performing a mitzvah, and it goes to another level when we're talking about Gragan Amalek, or blotting out the memory of Amalek, Haman. Suffice it to say, people get into it. Of course, history never lacked for Amaleks and Hamans, and you'll often hear people either say the term Yimach Shemo, Hebrew for may his name be blotted out, when they mention latter-day incarnations of Amalek, or sometimes even more efficiently, they'll just substitute may his name be blotted out for the actual name, as in the sentence. This reminds me of when Yimach Shemo first came to power in Germany in 1933. It's a noteworthy way of speaking. The person's name becomes, their new name is, the one whose name should be eradicated. Interesting. One biblical figure who comes close to Amalek in infamy, we can argue, is Lavan, Laban, in this week's Parsha. Lavan never gets forgotten because his villainy has earned him a place in our Haggadah, even for the Jews who might not make it to Shul on Parshas Vayeitzei. There's a lot of people staying at home these Shabbosos because of the pandemic and the provincial lockdown restrictions. But even those who might not make it in the best of years to hear the story about Yaakov and his father-in-law Lavan and his trickery and deception over marrying the older daughter Leah before the younger daughter Rachel, or other assorted frauds, even a Jew who doesn't manage to hear the Megillah on Purim, for sure they're going to hear about Lavan when they sit down to the Seder and they come across the words in the Haggadah, Paro only sought to destroy the males, it says, but Lavan bikesh la'akoras hakol. Lavan sought to uproot the entire project. What was so bad? What did he do that was so bad that it merits comparison to Pharaoh, and maybe even worse? Rabbi Sachs writes that it's really about Lavan's view of Yaakov and how he treated him. Lavan gave, and then he took back. He extended rights, and then he retracted them. He pursued Yaakov, was trying to leave after having paid his dues, and compelled him to come back to his land. He uses the old bait and switch, changing the rules, moving the goalposts over and over again. There's a kind of persecution that involves killing Jews. That's a terrible thing. There's another facet, another angle of persecution that makes us, considers us not even worthy human beings. We're slaves like in Egypt. We're subhumans. We're not even worthy of the common rights and privileges of any other human being. And this has really been part of our existence, well, since the times of Lavan in this week's Parsha. The Sedra tells us that where this attitude originates, and maybe we're supposed to learn the lesson from here. Yaakov's skills at maneuvering an opportunity into reality comes into play here. Remember, last week's Parsha, he managed to finagle the birthright and the blessing for himself. He was called a supplanter, perhaps even a deceiver. Not exactly like that. The definition doesn't sit too well. Let's call it he's possessed of ingenuity. Yaakov's ingenuity comes into play again in this week's portion. His ability to see an opportunity and make the most of it. Although he seems destined to spend a good chunk of time in Lavan's orbit, he brokers a deal that allows him to keep the profits of his very successful talent for breeding sheep. Owning flocks in those days represented holdings of wealth. Sort of like the RRSP of its time. The Parsha describes in some detail how Yaakov manages to increase the flocks greatly, and by the end of the Sedra, he's a substantially wealthy person. Let's talk about yet another facet of another angle of Yaakov's life, and that is, how did he manage to live in close proximity to a Lavan, such an immoral person, while retaining his bearings? In other words, how does a person retain his sense of moral grounding when that is not necessarily rewarded or even tolerated so well by the larger society? Let's call it the question of moral man in immoral society. Now, I wish I could take credit for such a snappy summarization of the issue, but I can't. I'll give credit where credit's due, though. The phrase moral man and immoral society is actually the title of a book from the 1930s by the theologian and social critic Reinhold Niebuhr, who sounds like he was from Germany, but he wasn't. He was actually an American, born in Missouri, right in the middle of America. He was a Protestant minister and a public intellectual. Later in life, he was a professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. One of the arguments Niebuhr makes in his book of this title, Moral Man and Immoral Society, is that a society by its very nature cannot raise itself to the moral level of what an individual person can achieve. A society, by definition, must always act politically, so it cannot behave with a perfectly tuned, finely tuned sense of ethics like the individual does. He says that just by virtue of being, societies contain within them injustices, imbalances of power, coercions, and other dynamics that on the face of them are unethical. What we should be aiming for, in his view anyway, is the society with the most justice, the most equity, realizing that the perfect ideal is maybe unattainable. Again, that's what he says. We're of course looking to a time when there is, where truth and justice do reign. But in the meantime, until we get to the Messianic era, what is the individual supposed to do? The individual person must maintain his or her moral compass and spiritual anchor. He or she must do the best they can in less than ideal circumstances. That's precisely what we see in our parsha this week. Yaakov marries first Leah, then Rachel, then sets about building a family, raising his portfolio, doing the best that he can with what he has. He hears Lavan's son speaking ill of him, jealous of his productivity, his industry, and God says, go back to Israel. So he tells his family, let's go, it's time to go, because Lavan barely tolerates us on his territory anymore. And they make their way out of Haran. Yaakov and his caravan leave. Lavan, of course, chases after them, accuses Yaakov of sneaking away, which is a little bit improbable because he's taking his wives, taking his maidservants, 12 children, who knows how many herds of animals with them. And while they're having this conversation, Lavan accuses Yaakov of theft, of dishonesty. Here's the pot calling the kettle black. Lavan says, you stole my gods. There were some kind of figures or figurines or something called teraphim, which maybe they were some kind of idol. According to Ramban, maybe they were just some kind of timekeeping device, we're not sure. Anyway, Lavan accuses Yaakov of sneaking away with this huge family and flocks of his, and proceeds to go about rummaging through the whole caravan looking for these little getchkas, looking for these little teraphim. I think it's the first stop and search in the Bible, if you're keeping track. Lavan, of course, wasn't able to find anything, so they make a pact. Now, from Yaakov's point of view, it's tough to know what the truth is when the thieves are accusing you of stealing. What can be more confusing or disorienting when you have fraudsters, liars, tricksters accusing others of fraud, of lying, and of stealing? It beggars belief. But you know what's funny about people? They believe it. They buy it hook, line, and sinker. You can have someone who's the most dishonest, the most personally immoral, the most flagrant violator of every rule in the book, and once that person claims to have discovered other people's fraudulent behavior, it becomes all accusatory and indignant. As we say, it's a story as old as the Bible. So what's a person to do? Lavan makes himself out to be the victim. He says, Vatigno ves levavi, you've stolen my heart. You've tried to hurt my feelings. Here's the trickster, the herder of feelings, who's making himself out to be the victim here. It would be laughable on the face of it because Lavan's self-serving duplicity is so transparent, but at the same time, it's very seductive to believe such a con man when he wraps himself in the mantle of victimhood. Apparently, that's very easy for many people to swallow. I want to suggest that's why this story is so important. That's why it gets such a lengthy, detailed treatment in the Torah. And perhaps even maybe why Lavan seems to be the villain of all villains in Jewish history, a history which doesn't lack for villains. We got him 10 a penny, right? So much so that we mention his name in the Haggadah, the Seder night when we're recalling the Exodus from Egypt, and how Paro and the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, made life bitter, makes our nose run and our eyes water up and all that, make us so miserable from enslaving. At that point, we say in the Haggadah, Lavan, however bad Paro was, Lavan bikesh la'akor es hakol. Lavan tried to uproot everything. Lavan is that enduring, eternal admixture of falsehood into personal dealings and family and tribal relationships and society at large. Lavan represents the naked falsehood that's so obvious that paradoxically has no problem disguising itself as a reality. Mendacity that claims victimhood, even as it doesn't hesitate for a moment to victimize others, even the whole of society. What's our mission? Where are we, the Jewish people, in all this? We're supposed to remember, we're obliged to remember where truth is situated and where falsehood is located. The Jewish people have a special obligation to remain firmly and confidently rooted in truth, even when the winds of falsehood are swirling all around us. There's a glimpse of Lavan's reality in one of the commentators, Kedushas Levi, says that he explains that when Lavan was surprised to hear a defense of Yaakov from God, no less. Right? God appears to Lavan in a dream and says, "Don't even speak badly of Yaakov, let alone whatever else." Lavan genuinely figured that Yaakov was just as dishonest as he was, right? Just as immoral, just as slippery. He couldn't realize, he couldn't see that Yaakov was, in fact, striving to be that moral man in immoral society. Yaakov's skill and talent was to be able to see through the falsehood and the superficiality around him and extract the goodness and the positive in a situation and make something good come out of any circumstances. We are called by his name. We're called Beis Yaakov, Beth Jacob, if you will, the house of Jacob, because we too are able to do this as long as we stay focused on the morals and values and mitzvahs of Judaism. We can, and we have, lived in many immoral societies. And in fact, if you believe Niebuhr's argument, every society is destined to have a certain degree of immorality. It's inescapable. And at the same time, we're always able to extract some good from it, to bring light, to represent the truth wherever we go. I always argue, why is it that it makes the news to its headlines when a Jew is found to be dishonest or fraudulent? The Jews are such a tiny minority in any society. Who cares what the Jews do? Fact is, there's something that others recognize, that we should really recognize ourselves. We represent the moral man, the moral person, updating the idea to our times. We embody that notion that we can and we do live a moral and upright life, no matter what the prevailing moral climate is. A Jew ought never to say, well, everybody else is doing it, so I might as well get mine. We're the ones who carry the torch of godliness and truth and righteousness to illuminate the darkness of immorality and duplicity and mendacity, which often masquerades as the truth. The victimizers presenting themselves as victims, and liars calling out others for fraud. But the descendants of those children of Yaakov ought to know better. We're the ones who go along our way, as the last verses in the Parsha say, V'Yaakov halach ledarko. Yaakov went along on his way. Of course, the way of truth, the way of honesty, the way of God, the way of Torah. V'yifka uvo malachei Elokim, it says. And he met the angels of God along the way. If we remain firmly grounded in the Torah's values and the Torah's call to cling ardently to the truth, even when it's bought and sold right and left all around us, then we remain faithful to our mission, to be the model of a people who remain moral no matter what the nature of society is or becomes. The people who always model the idea of listening to the better angels of our nature. Good Shabbos.